Welcome to the next in our series of online lectures for Western Civ 1. In this lecture, we will be discussing ancient Israel and Western civilization, and to help you see what ideas you should be looking for throughout this lecture, I have listed some key terms and some key questions. I'd also like you to be able to find Israel on the map, as well as the city of Jerusalem as well. So anyway, with that said, let's get to it. But before we get to ancient Israel, let's review just a little bit. What have we learned about civilization so far? First of all, we have learned that civilization depends heavily upon agriculture for its existence. And also, what does civilization mean? Well, it means cities and urban areas. It means an organized government. It means an organized religion. It means writing. And it also means the development of a stratified society. And of course, what we mean by that is the development of social classes within a society. Today, we are going to focus on religion and its role in civilized society. Let's begin by talking about what we've seen so far. In the ancient world, organized religion was usually polytheistic. That meant that most cultures had many gods. Moreover, these gods were typically drawn from nature. The sun or the sky might be a god. A river might be a god, or a mountain. Why? Well, this has a lot to do with agriculture. Agriculture was the basis for civilization, and agriculture, of course, depends upon nature. Thus, it made sense to make nature into a god, or actually many gods. Today, we are going to meet a people who challenge some of those ideas. In doing so, they will make a major contribution to Western civilization that still has an impact on many of us today. The culture I'm talking about is that of the Hebrews. The Hebrews inhabited two kingdoms on the far western edge of the Fertile Crescent. The northern kingdom was known as Israel, and the southern kingdom was Judah. Both kingdoms were bordered by the Mediterranean Sea to the west and by the Dead Sea Desert to the east. The Hebrews were hardly the strongest people to inhabit this region, nor did they have the biggest population. However, the Hebrews will have a major impact on Western civilization. So, who were these people and why are they so important? The story of the ancient Hebrews is told in the Old Testament of the Christian Bible. In the book of Genesis chapter 11, it begins with a man named Abram who lived in the city of Ur. Now remember, Ur was one of the cities founded by the ancient Sumerians. It's part of the Fertile Crescent along the Euphrates River. According to the story, an unknown God spoke to Abram one day, telling him to leave Ur and move his family to the land of Canaan. In exchange, this God promised to make a great nation of Abram and his descendants. According to Scripture, Abram agreed to the God's request. He left Ur and traveled to Canaan, which is today part of Israel and Palestine. Abram and his ancestors would become the Hebrews, or as they called themselves, the chosen people of God. It's a good story. It's one I learned in Sunday school back when I was young. The problem is, we don't know if it's true or not. The Bible is not a history, it is a religious text. Religion is based primarily on faith and belief. The stories of the Bible are often based in fact, but they are told with the intent of encouraging faith. Historians, however, will try and base what they believe only on what they can prove. So, what do the facts tell historians about the history of ancient Israel? Well, first, there is no evidence that Abram ever existed at all. Instead, the cultural and factual record seems to indicate that instead of migrating into Canaan, the Hebrews were a group of independent tribes that already lived in the area. Sometime around the year 1200 BCE, they began to develop a single culture and a single identity. Now let me emphasize, this is a controversial belief. Not everybody accepts this idea. But we still haven't gotten to the point. Why do the Hebrews matter to us today? Well, it's not because they created a vast empire that ruled the world. It's not because they were a rich people with wealth that was envied by others. Instead, it's due to a number of ideas that they developed that still influence Western civilization today. The first of those ideas comes from their religion. The key word here is monotheism. Monotheism means a belief in just one God. Mono means one. Get it? This distinguished the Hebrews from most, though not all, ancient peoples who were polytheists. Polytheism, of course, means many gods. And many of these gods were based on nature. We talked about this already. The sun, the river, the wind. All of these might be considered to be gods in a polytheistic culture. Many scholars today believe that the ancient Hebrews were originally like the other peoples of Mesopotamia. They were polytheistic and worshipped many gods. Over time, however, the Hebrews came to believe that one God was supreme. Still later, they came to believe that their God was the only God. They called their God Yahweh. Now, I'm going to explain that name just a little bit. Yahweh was very different from other gods around the ancient world. For one thing, Yahweh was not a part of nature. Yahweh was not a mountain or a river or the sun or the moon. Instead, the Hebrews believed that Yahweh created and controlled nature. Nor did the Hebrews make statues or paint pictures of Yahweh. Now, many of the polytheistic societies all drew pictures or had statues or idols of their gods. The Hebrews did not. That's because Yahweh did not take a physical form. Yahweh was a mysterious spiritual force. Even his name, Yahweh, demonstrated this. Yahweh isn't really the name of a god at all. Instead, it's simply the Hebrew word for I am. The name comes from the book of Exodus, where God appears to Moses in the form of a burning bush. Many of you have probably heard that story. Now, when Moses asked this God his name, the reply was simply, I am who I am. Moreover, the Hebrews' relationship with Yahweh was quite different from the relationships other ancient peoples had with their gods. While the gods of Mesopotamia cared little for humanity and often punished their peoples without reason, Yahweh cared for his people as long as they behaved themselves. If they followed his laws, all was well, and they would be blessed. If, however, they broke his laws, he often would punish them. Nor was Yahweh a distant God. Instead, Yahweh cared about individuals regardless of their wealth or their power. This again distinguishes Yahweh from the other gods of the ancient world. Take this quote from Psalms, for example. Quote, "My help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. He will not let your foot slip. He who watches over you will not slumber." This is the kind of thought that none of the cultures of ancient Mesopotamia would have ever expressed this kind of a thought about one of their gods. Their gods didn't care if their feet slipped. Their gods didn't care about them really at all. And so this also will distinguish Yahweh from the other cultures and the other gods of the ancient world. But the Hebrew faith did have some things in common with the polytheistic beliefs of their neighbors. For one thing, the Hebrew faith was ritualistic. In other words, the Hebrews believed they had to follow certain rituals to please Yahweh. At the heart of these rituals was the need to regularly offer a sacrifice to Yahweh in the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem became the Hebrew capital under King David. And you can see on the map where the arrow is, that's where Jerusalem was situated, right between Israel to the north and Judah to the south. It's sort of right in the middle of both of them. David's son, Solomon, built a grand temple for Yahweh. The building was supposedly one of the grandest of the ancient world. Here is the picture from your textbook of that temple. I mean, my gosh, this is an incredibly grand structure. You can imagine why people came from all around just to see this temple, let alone to worship in it. And again, let me emphasize, for the ancient Hebrews, this temple was the center of their religion. They believed that they had to worship Yahweh properly. They needed to do so in this temple. Monotheism proved to be a very powerful idea. Why? Well, as I said before, the ancient Hebrews lived in a very dangerous neighborhood. Never a strong and powerful people, they were surrounded by enemies that coveted their land. At various times, Israel was threatened by Egypt, the Philistines, and by the great empires to the east. The Assyrians were the first to rise. The great and cruel Assyrians, who we will meet in the next lecture, conquered the northern Hebrew kingdom of Israel in the year 722 BCE. Possibly 27,000 of the leading figures of that society, mainly priests, wealthy individuals, and political leaders, were forcibly removed from their homeland and removed to Assyria. These people were never heard from again. The southern Hebrew kingdom of Judah survived the Assyrian onslaught. However, they too were conquered by another people, a people known as the Babylonians, in the year 586 BCE. Like their countrymen to the north, up to 30,000 members of the southern Hebrew tribes were forced into exile in Babylon. Worst of all, the temple built by King Solomon, the center of the Hebrew faith, was destroyed. The very basis for the Hebrew religion seemed destined to disappear forever. Because remember, the Hebrew temple was the centerpiece of the Hebrew religion. So with the temple gone, many felt that the Hebrew religion was simply vanished. The Hebrew people, it was believed, were destined to disappear along with their temple. The Hebrew scriptures reflect this concern, as Psalm 137 above indicates. Here, I'll read it for you. For there they that carried us away captive required of us a song, and they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. But how shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? This is a rather sad quotation, because the Hebrews are saying, how can we worship our God? How can we practice our religion so far from home? But then something strange happened. Through their belief in Yahweh, the Jews were able to maintain their cultural identity, even living far from their homeland in Babylon. Why? Well, let's take a look at polytheism again. Again, polytheism means many gods. Excuse me. These gods were all often tied to nature, especially a specific mountain or a river. And once the people left that area, their god did not travel with them. Instead, they were more apt to adopt the local gods of a religion and assimilate into the local culture. Thus, they lost their identity. But because Yahweh was above nature, the Hebrews believed he was everywhere. And even though their temple was in ruins, they found they could worship him in Babylon just as they did in Jerusalem. This allows the Hebrews to maintain their cultural identity, even though they are so far from home. Moreover, remember that the Hebrews believed that Yahweh was watching everything they did. They believed that they were defeated by the Babylonians, not because the Babylonians were stronger than they. Instead, they believed it was because they had failed to keep Yahweh's laws. Thus, they argued that, as Yahweh's chosen people, they could win back his favor by keeping his laws and rededicating themselves to their faith. But there was something else that helped the Hebrews to maintain their cultural identity. They also began to consolidate many of the stories that would become the Hebrew holy books, the Hebrew holy texts. These books are what the Christians today call the Old Testament. The Jews call them the Tanakh. By writing these stories down, The Hebrews were helping to preserve themselves and their culture.